Don't listen in the dark.
Aunt Kelsey's coffin.
"1 o'clock was creeping into a cold night at the Final Peace Cemetery on the outskirts of town. Easily the most peaceful place you could ever hope to be, but at the same time, who would ever want to be there? Richie, that's who. Richie was a middle-aged man, distinguished facial features framed by a wise beard. His profession was one as old as death itself: grave robbing. The hours were a little rough, and the sights and smells were interesting to say the least, but you never know what you'll find out there, and the rewards could be phenomenal. Richie remembered as clear as day when he picked up his macabre vocation. He was 25 years old, fresh out of college with a liberal arts degree, and nowhere to go. His student loans were starting to get the best of him, and he was always looking for work, but then a break came in the form of a telegram. His great-aunt Kelsey had bit the dust at the tender age of 97, and an inheritance was sure to be his. Aunt Kelsey had a load of money, and while it was unfortunate she had passed away, she would help him more now than she could ever know. After a meeting with her attorney immediately following the funeral, it was revealed that she had indeed left him a sizable inheritance. However, it was in the form of a donation to charity in his name. Lousy, he thought to himself. That's just like her to go the self-righteous route. As he headed home, he reflected on the whole ordeal when something struck him. When they buried his aunt, she had on a necklace. A large blue diamond necklace. Blue diamonds were incredibly rare, and it had always been a centerpiece of Aunt Kelsey's extensive collection of jewelry, all of which had been donated to charity, except for what she was wearing at her burial. Richie tried to shake the ghastly thoughts, but they just made too much sense to him. She didn't need it anymore, and that diamond alone could pay nearly half of his loans. So, he took a jar of change from his bedroom and cashed it in to buy a shovel. It was an investment in his future. As he walked carefully into the graveyard, shovel in hand, it became clear how obvious his crime would look if he were caught. But who would catch him? No one visits this old cemetery at night. The caretaker wasn't there more than once a week by the look of the grass. The earth was still soft from the recent burial. It wasn't difficult at all. A little elbow grease, and before he knew it, his shovel hit the wood lid of Aunt Kelsey's coffin. Inscribed on the front was, "Eternal peace be with you," with some golden leaves on either side. Prying it open took a little finesse, but sure enough, he got his fingers under the lid, ready to lift it. As the lid swung open, Richie lost his balance and fell forward. He put his hand out to break his fall and ended up landing on Aunt Kelsey's face. The feeling shocked him. As he lifted himself back up and moved his hand, he felt sick to his stomach. Her face had warped and distorted. The wax the mortician used to mold her face into a pleasing form for the funeral had flattened on half of her skull and stretched on the other side, revealing muscle and bone. Richie turned his head away for a moment, trying to regain control of his stomach, and it worked, but only just barely. Richie left the cemetery with the blue diamond and 3 gold rings. Bills weren't a problem for him for quite some time. The image of Aunt Kelsey's twisted face may have stuck with him for a while, but the ease at which he had made so much money stayed with him even longer. Before long, Richie was hitting 3 graveyards a month. The hardest part was just putting the grass and dirt back the way he had found it, but after a while he had become an expert. He would drive out into the country, check into a motel with a fake name, and head into the cemetery that night. The older the cemetery, the less people were there, and the more valuable the jewelry. Final Peace Cemetery was one of his best finds to date. It wasn't listed on any maps. He found it strictly from word of mouth. No one had been buried there since the 50s. Some of the grave markers went back to Civil War days. This could mean some serious money in the bank. Richie had a strict method he would follow when robbing graves, and they were pretty simple. The larger headstones with older dates had a better chance of having something of value. Also, only dig up women's graves. Men don't tend to have many valuables on their person when they get planted. The first grave marker was a bust. The lady only had a wedding band on. Richie was disappointed, but he was optimistic of his next spot. A light fog had descended over the cemetery like a blanket, trying to keep all the souls warm through the cold night. Sometimes, when he's not sure where to dig, he would just walk around until his gut told him to stop. That had paid off pretty well in the past. As he walked along, he came to a very large grave marker. It read, Agnes Thompson, 1801 to 1885. He got that feeling in his gut and decided this was as good a place as any. As he stomped his shovel into the hard earth beneath him, a chill hit him right in the back of the neck. It felt like someone was watching him. Though that is not really an uncommon feeling in his line of work, but it was particularly intense to him that night. Getting the creeps was business as usual for him, but he tried very well to ignore it. He made it through the first few feet of dirt no problem. Every now and then, Richie would stop to look around the yard. Something really had him spooked. He kept working, and finally he heard the familiar thud of the shovel hitting wood. Pay dirt, he said. Scooping away the dirt took only a matter of moments. He reached over the side of the hole and grabbed his lantern. As he brought the lantern down, it revealed the casket lid, which had some tasteful gold leaves and an inscription. Eternal peace be with you. Richie stopped for a moment to think. Where had he seen that before? Then it hit him. This casket was a dead ringer for the one his Aunt Kelsey had been buried in 20 years ago. A feeling of dread swept across him. Thinking back to that night wasn't pleasant at all. Every night of grave robbing was easier than the last, but that first night was the cruelest to him. He felt another chill go over him as he looked around again, and found no one was there, but he couldn't seem to get it through his thick skull. Finally, he got his nerve back and started prying at the coffin lid. It creaked loudly as it opened. For some reason, every part of Richie's body told him to stop. He felt like he should close it back and just get out of there, not even place the dirt back. Just run for his life. He took a deep breath as the lid slowly lifted. It felt so heavy, or maybe he wanted it to be heavy so he wouldn't open it. As the lid opened the rest of the way, Richie strained, closing his eyes. The coffin was empty. There was nothing at all inside. Maybe someone else had gotten to it. He'd never had that happen to him before, but he couldn't be the only one stealing from the dead. This night has been a total loss, he said to himself. I may as well go home. He slammed the casket lid down hard and started to climb. He crawled out of the hole and began to rise to his feet. As he rose, he felt a snag on his coat. He grabbed it to shake it free, but what he felt in his hand was cold, damp, and soft. It was locked on his coat sleeve. As he tried to pull it off, he then heard a yell. He looked over to his side to see on the ground next to him a disgusting, rotted corpse, its teeth exposed and mouth wide open, letting out the most horrible yell. Don't steal, it moaned in its horrible, mangled voice. Richie let out a scream. His heart started to pound so hard he thought it could come out of his throat. The slimy creature slowly sat up and turned its head to look right at Richie. Only, it couldn't look at him. Its eyes were rotted out, and all that were left were sockets where worms were wriggling their way free out of his head. Richie finally jumped to his feet. No, this isn't real. You're not real, he pleaded. He turned to run, and at that moment, he saw a face. A familiar face. Standing in front of him, behind the fog and the pale light of the moon, was the twisted face of Aunt Kelsey. Richie, she moaned. You stole from me. As she let out those terrible words, Richie stood in shock. None of this could be happening, not in real life. A second figure came out of the shadows next to the rotten Aunt Kelsey. She was a terribly thin creature, her clothes filthy with dirt and grime. She held her chin tightly with her left hand. Her eyes were dark and piercing. Do you remember me? She forced out in a groan. The chain of my necklace wouldn't clasp, so you cut off my head. Richie panicked. No, you're dead! All of you are dead! Another figure came out from the black. It let out an eerie voice. My rings were so important to you that you cut off my fingers. You even pried out my gold teeth. Richie wanted to run, but his legs didn't work. The fear engulfed him entirely. The apparitions began to speak. Oh, Richie. The dead is a terrible way to make a living. Richie couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. All he saw was black. Then his eyes finally began to focus. The terrible face of Aunt Kelsey pierced through him as the coffin lid slowly closed over top. Now all was truly black. Richie kicked and screamed. He pounded on the lid, trying to break free. Please, let me out of here. I'll give it back. I'll give it back, he pleaded. Aunt Kelsey spoke to Richie from outside of the casket. Don't be afraid. When I died, I was lucky enough to get a visitor. But Richie, you don't have any gold or diamonds. So I guess you'll be alone for a long, long time. The dead truly are a terrible way to make a living.